This is a very interesting situation that we're in. We're two Silicon Valley guys meeting up in Bangalore, and bulk of you are actually going to be online. So we do have a few folks here in the design studio at the Kormangala campus. So certainly welcome all of you. Good evening to folks in India, and for folks in the US, certainly a very good morning. It is an awesome pleasure to actually host Raj. I met him for the first time, I think about a month and a half ago, where Professor Raj Yavatkar introduced us, and his charismatic style and humbleness is still contagious enough that I still give examples of that conversation when we met to everybody around. So it's actually a pleasure to host you.
Thank you.
So, obviously we all have the introduction that Padmaja gave, but what's fascinating is there are very few folks who come from a very strong engineering pedigree, grow up in the engineering ladder, and still understand, business. So before we get into the topic of the day, can you maybe tell us a little bit about a fellow? And this is a very not a new thing in the Silicon Valley, but certainly for people in India, usually, kitne aadmi hai,
My father used to be very disappointed that nobody reported to me. And he said, you claim to be a big fellow. What do you do?
Absolutely. And so the question is, how many fellows report to a fellow, which usually are not a whole lot. Can you tell us a little bit about what this role and this distinguished engineer, fellow, CTO path even means in the context of VMware, and maybe kind of give a little bit of a reference in the Silicon Valley, what this is for our audience who might not be as aware of this title.
Yeah, so I think this notion of technical leadership and technical ladder came originally from companies like AT&T and IBM, and Silicon Valley adopted it, right? So I think one of the first companies to have those kind of titles was either Intel or Texas Instruments, because those are semiconductor companies, a Fairchild. So idea was that you have an individual contributor, you're an engineer, but as you grow in your capacity and have more and more strategic impact, not just technical impact, you get recognized on this ladder as principal engineer, distinguished engineer, or fellow. A fellow is the highest technical position in most of the companies. So I first was appointed Intel fellow in 2003. And that time Intel had about maybe 80,000 employees, and there were about 35 fellows. Right, and one of the things was, if you got appointed as fellow, you got to have dinner with Andy Grove and his wife.
Nice.
So it was considered purposely it was created as an exclusive position, so people stay on technical track.
Absolutely.
They don't have to go into the management position.
And encourage them to not worry about the people management side, process management side, but kind of remain more inventive, innovative. Right?
And also start connecting their work broadly to more strategic vision and so on.
Absolutely. So, looking at the strength of this title, obviously, how many fellows do we have in VMware, if you had to guess?
So we have 5.
We have total 5. So 20,000 people, give or take, in VMware, and there's just 5 fellows, so obviously, this is very, very fortuitous for us.
An interesting note to tell you that in the VMware website, if you look at the executives, they list all the executive VPs and all. They don't list VPs, but they do list fellows.
They do list fellows. Very nice.
I don't know why, but somebody pointed out to me recently.
I think that's your humbleness. I think we all know why, because of obviously the accomplishments that you guys have had and the recognition. So that's great to hear. So I think from a community perspective, we obviously hear questions like, hey, look, the word product leader sometimes is narrowly construed as somebody who's a product management and a little bit perhaps more senior product manager.
Right.
Whereas in the Valley, it's very clear that, look, at the end of the day, you work in a product company, you could be, playing any title. Your business card might say whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
And yet you have to kind of start executing, thinking, designing, the mindset. What is your, obviously you've gone through the engineering ladder and you're now moved into a lot more product innovation. You in fact run like a CTO skunkworks team for new products and new ventures within VMware. Can you walk us through a little bit of that journey on how does one go from an engineer to becoming a product leader and not necessarily a product manager?
Right. Yeah. I think that's a very good question, because I can tell you from my own personal experience. Many times when I was a fellow, I would initiate an idea, take it to a level, and then somebody else would take over. And then there's always a tension because, you have a vision, strategy, but somebody else comes along and they have to be more practical and pragmatic in terms of delivery. So I did one of the projects once where I insisted that I take it to the end. That was my precondition to the management. And that's where I really understood what it takes to be a product leader. Because it's not enough to define the vision, define the strategy and start executing on it. There are a whole bunch of other things that you have to start considering, including, product positioning that many engineers like look down upon product marketing and positioning. It looks like politics, which really in reality is very important.
Absolutely.
When I did that product, I didn't realize that how you position to the customers is all about whether they will buy it or not. Doesn't matter what the content is. So to understand this, all the phases of the product is what the product leader has to do.
Interesting. If you had to say, if they had to put an equation, again, talking to an extremely technical and yet a business savvy guy, product leader or engineer plus something equals product leader. What is that something in your mind?
I think the end-to-end ownership, starting from strategic vision and all the way to look at all the aspects of the product delivery to the customer, including leaving the customer pain points and understanding what it takes so that you don't start. One of the things I want to point out, once you deliver the first product or launch it, many product managers also get into this successive refinement. Product leader looks beyond that because the industry is changing fast. You have to look at the trends and you have to look at all the competitors and what the customers are looking at so that you can define the next phase of the product very clearly.
Absolutely.
And that's a distinction.
Interesting. So if an engineer walks up to you and say, hey, look, Raj, you're a role model for us, and I want to get to becoming a product leader. If I ever become a fellow or not is certainly a dream.
Right.
What would you say is your key advice or key takeaways for him to start thinking, start planning on what areas for him to remain in engineering,
right?
Because he might be passionate about technology,
yeah.
But still, strive to get to that path of being a product leader. What would you say is the key thing that he needs to plan for, start thinking about today for him to be successful moving into that role?
So I think start understanding the other parts of the business as much as possible, right? So for example, if you're a technical engineer, you always have some relationship with sales. Because customer requirements come in or you have to go talk to the customer. But people don't take time to understand the sales process. Because in fact, people are dismissive of the sales process, right? Because why does this guy have to do this much song and dance? Why don't we get to the point, right? Same thing as I said earlier, product positioning. There's also P&L aspect of it, right? Many times the decisions are made by the management, which generate lots of negative reaction. And that they're all driven by P&L. Because you have to plan for the P&L. And people don't take time to understand that. So I was giving advice similar to one of the principal engineers who's trying to decide what to do. And I said, start shadowing people, right? You have time. So start shadowing different disciplines. Then you'll understand the end-to-end process. And that might spark interest into what you want to do.
So are you saying then that it is not as important for somebody to become a product manager as a milestone, and yet you can continue to that journey in engineering to become a product leader?
No, I'm not saying that. But product management is not a stop enough, I'm saying. Because a lot of time product managers also stay in that same loop of refining products and successive launches, successive releases, and that doesn't make you a product leader. You have to expand beyond that to really take the ownership of the end-to-end process and start becoming more strategic thinker. One of the things people don't do and you have to do is that you have to learn how to sell ideas to the upper management, right? How to position. And that requires a different skill because you have to up-level it, you have to sometimes, people think it's more political because you have to wrap it in a different package. And those skills are very important.
Scale the story.
To
figure out to say,
exactly.
How do we say an elevator
and also
pitch
understand the strategic context for the company. Company is going through, there are lots of priorities, the other businesses competing interests. If you can position yourself with aligning those, then only get funding. So I think those kind of skills are not necessarily product manager. Product managers are typically handed something, then they do PRD, MVP, all that stuff. But that's a very traditional function.
Got it. So with obviously, Agile as a development methodology that's kind of catching on, especially in the tech sector, distributed teams.
Yep.
We're hearing a lot more, even in larger companies, rapid prototyping,
Yep.
fail fast. In that context, what do you think is the new role of an engineering manager, which predominantly might have been people and process management in the past? And now we're saying is democratization, agile is kind of putting the power back to the engineer to decide
Yeah.
as opposed to the manager to dictate. In that changing situation, what do you see at VMware or companies in the Silicon Valley on what is the changing role of an engineering manager, or an engineering leader?
I think there are three things engineering managers have to evolve into. Thought leadership, people leadership, which they normally do. So if you start with thought leadership and then operational leadership. Now, operational leadership is beyond agile, right? Because agile says you are going to get into sprint planning quickly, so mostly the engineers or tech leads are doing the work. But there are lots of aspects of operational leadership that are ignored typically by engineering managers because there's so much involved in focusing on internals of a product development rather than looking outside. So thought leadership, because you have to start thinking about the context in which you operate, what are the new trends coming up. Think like a competitor. How is competitor going to react to my product? So that sort of thing will lead to start positioning new ideas and new trends that they start coming from you. People start looking at you as a thought leader. People leadership is important. Many people do that. Operational leadership has different aspects. Now, one example I'll give you, right? When you do this agile methodology and you're doing development, you're on a fast-paced thing. Communication is extremely important across different functions. And people nowadays use Slack channels. And I was talking to, and a lot of engineering managers think it's just social media. But I find it extremely useful because Slack-like channel or even Skype for Business allows you to stay in touch with different parts of the function. You are doing sprint demos. Bring in your sales guy. Bring in a marketing guy. And when you see the problems, so the customer support can have a completely first-hand seat. Only engineering managers can do that. And that way you expand your role and you have different focus.
Interesting. How much of this you think is a function of mindset change versus skill set change? The ability to think like a product manager, obviously, or a product leader, the end-to-end thinking. You mentioned competitive context, business context, customer context. So wanting to do it is one thing. The ability to do it is more of a skill set and practice. Where do you see engineers today, in organizations in the Valley, and maybe certainly from a VMware context or Intel context, where is that journey, and where do you see people kind of struggling today in that mindset versus skill set discussion?
So I think you need both, but mindset is where people are stuck. Mindset change is hard to make because I tell you, many engineering managers who have been very successful are already leaders. So leadership, when we talk about it, whether it's thought, operational people, they have the leadership skills, which has certain charismatic things, communication skills, and so on. But making a transition to product leadership requires making a mindset change so that you can start acquiring new skills. Okay, you can teach yourself lots of the skills or start learning them. So you need both. The mindset change is the most important.
Okay, and we certainly look forward to questions from the audience. If you have not started sending your questions, certainly queue them in. I think somebody from the team here is going to show me so I can ask those questions on your behalf. Certainly, we'll give the privilege to the folks who are in the campus here in presence to also ask that question as well. So feel free to jump in. And while questions kind of come in, I wanted to kind of ask a slightly different question in terms of the technology and the pace with which we're kind of moving, from cloud to IoT and artificial intelligence and machine learning. And today we're talking about AR and VR and down the road, there'll be new acronyms that we don't even know about yet 2 years from now. How does a product leader stay abreast with this fast-moving pace? Because certainly you may not be an expert on many things. And in fact, the very reason you became an engineer was an expertise in certain things. those certain things may no longer
Be
be
relevant.
relevant in today's world. What's your advice for people who how do you kind of navigate this? How do you do this in your personal? I mean, you're in the forefront of innovation as a fellow. You probably have access and see things even beyond what other normal senior executive in a company can see. How do you personally stay ahead, always engaged, always understanding? And what's your advice for others if we can all learn from you?
I think to start with, my advice is two words: be afraid.
Mm.
I'm always scared because I'm going to be left behind. Because literally, there are two factors, right? Technology is continuously evolving very fast, right? You just see the microservices architecture came and everybody jumped on that. Everybody jumps on lots of new ideas.
Right.
ML is another thing. So you have to be a little bit paranoid that how do I continue to stay at the sharp edge. But the other trick is, which I try to do, is that you cannot become expert, deep expert in everything. So you have to choose things and try to develop breadth as much as possible. But I think being afraid that you're going to out is a good motivation to stay abreast. But I think there's only a certain number of hours in a day. So you have to pick and choose where you want to. But mostly I focus on developing what I call T-shape, right? Breadth first and maybe depth in something.
What do you what do you use to stay abreast? Are there particular journals, blogs, Harvard articles, Economic Times for those who are in India? I mean, what do you use today? What is your personal secret to stay ahead of figuring out what's happening?
So I think I keep track of multiple things. Wired magazine, MIT Technology Review are my favorite things. IEEE computer and IEEE. I'm a networking person, so I also IEEE communication is important to me. But also I have identified few people who write very good blogs, the cloud computing area, for example, and I subscribe to those. They are I always get them. And usually I use my weekends, evenings. Twitter is a very good source if you have the right, don't follow Trump, but follow good people.
Right.
Then you get very good pointers.
Yeah.
You know, Martin Casado used to be a fellow at VMWARE. He's a partner at Sequoia now. No, Anderson. So I follow him or Ben Horowitz. And they give pointers to lots of articles and all that.
To stay engaged, network, even if it's...
The other thing I do, by the way, when I see an interesting article, I have a distribution list among some friends.
Interesting.
And do that so that they will share with me if they see something.
Absolutely. You build your own little social network of interested people sharing
email
things.
list that I always send to.
Yeah. That's one thing that has amazed me as well, now that I've spent a little bit of time in India. The value of networking, whether it is offline or online, is perhaps not as native, not as important to an average engineer in India. Part of it is because nobody's asked them to do it. Part of it is because just the way they kind of grew professionally. Do you see a stark difference between your engineering talent in this aspect in an Indian context versus a US context? What's that stark difference do you see, in an engineer who's in India versus the same equivalent engineer, apples to apples in the US?
That's a very good question. I need to think about it. But I think because I want to be careful because...
And this is not about VMware. This is just
no, in general, I think. But I want to avoid any stereotypes also, right? So I think the most important difference I see, that Indian engineers are curious. They really want to know what's going on. It could be the reason because they're far away from the Silicon Valley. So that I see, they're not complacent. But at the same time, I think I just talking to a few engineers last night. They have this sense that somebody else is better. Some sort of inferiority complex sometimes about technology. That keeps people back. The other thing I do not see is that taking advantage of their network. Because in the Bangalore is another valley, right, where people keep on moving between the companies. If you keep touch with those, you build a better. What happens? Valley every 3-4 years between the companies. And soon they have friends everywhere, and that helps a lot. I think that I don't see as much. At least I have not seen that yet.
Yes, there was a question in the audience. Yes, go ahead.
So I wish I could take credit for that, but I think some of that is serendipitous because every 4 years or so, I ended up working on different area. I started out as a pure networking guy, worked on routers, switches, NICs, then started a new business at Intel called network processors. It was until the dot-com burst, it was a good business. Then I had to get out of networking because Intel sold off the business, so got into systems. Because if you're an operating system person, you can always go back to server systems. And server world evolved into virtualization, security, manageability, and the cloud computing. And I had some background distributed systems. So one of the advice I always give people is that don't be scared about moving into adjacent areas, because that's how you expand your scope. So that helped me a lot. Many times because of no choice or because of out of my own desire, I moved into another area every 4 years. And that's how I ended up in cloud computing.
There's a question online that Meeta is asking. Is it mandatory for product managers to be an engineer? Is there a scope for non-technical people to become a product leader?
Yes, sometimes I think I have seen examples of product leaders who came from sales because they were very customer oriented, but they were also connected to the product team and they made the transition. It's not common, but I have seen that transition. I think the best example of that transition is Sanjay Poonan, who is the number 2 guy in VMware. But otherwise, it's a natural thing for engineers to move into from a technical background because they're so close to the product. Becoming a product manager becomes easier. Your credibility with the engineering team, that's very important. But I don't think it's necessary. You can, I think you have to have some strengths which connect you to the people that you're going to work with. So sales is a good background.
There's another one from Sushank Sahu. And his question is, if you had to do a percentage pie chart, what percentage of business skills, domain skills, and kind of functional skills would you need in the optimum mix for being a product leader? How do you balance in your own charting of the path of becoming a product leader and the gaps that you might have? What percentage of domain, what percentage of business, and what percentage of your kind of functional skills, technical skills are important in your mind
for a product leader?
For a product leader.
So it also depends on the area, right? There's a B2C, a B2B will have a different thing because consumer applications, I would say domain knowledge is very important, right? But if you are in an infrastructure kind of a B2B kind of things, the domain knowledge is not so important as having the combination of engineering skills and the business skills. That so it does. And having said that, and there's no formula, right? A lot of the people who do startups right out of school, they have none of those, right? They learn everything on the job.
But they're curious and they're afraid, to your point.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the key.
Yeah, fear is the best motivator.
Uday asks a very interesting question, Uday Sheth, and his question is, there are very few product leadership roles in the India region, even with companies like VMware, because the relevant business context is predominantly in the US, your customers and your markets might be there. So in that context, what's your advice for people in India to still aspire and still meaningfully get to play the role and build their career path towards product leadership?
By the way, that's changing. Even VMware has product managers now located here. The reason it hasn't happened is because a lot of the companies which came to the Bangalore area came as outsourcing operations. So they had first QE or some other functions which are not made. But that's fast changing as Indian economy grows. I mean, just the smart cities thing, right? India is making so much progress. Lots of the IoT product definition is happening here. Product managers are getting located. Even Cisco is located here. So I think as economy changes, that's changing. But you can always, Indian industry is pretty diverse right now. You don't have to work for an MNC to become a product leader. You can get the experience and move into a local company which requires product leadership.
Good point.
There are lots of them.
Good point. And so you're saying that even MNCs are now expanding their market horizons in Asia Pacific, India in particular. And in fact, you might even have a more advantageous position to be here for those markets than a US guy trying to figure this out.
And VMware example, we have one business unit with 250 engineers doing a core product here. So they place the product managers also here so that they can be next to each other.
Interesting.
So that's a change in the VMware in the last 2-3 years.
Which was not there in the last 10 years, perhaps, but is now happening.
Yeah.
So more and more product managers are happening in India, and more product leader mindset is also encouraged in India.
And
Is kind of
the new areas like IoT, definitely product leaders are emerging here, even for MNCs.
very nice. There's a very interesting question that Dheeraj Shetty is asking, and his question is, as a technocrat, as a technology leader, as you take the first step to sell yourself as a product leader, to position yourself, to signal yourself as more than just a technocrat, a technical leader in the organization, what are some best practices and tips? And I'm sure you've had to do this, and you probably have to continuously do this, as a fellow going off and pitching to the CEO who wants to understand business metrics and sales quota and forecast and P&L. What do you do as a first step? Is it the resume? Is it the skill? Is it the way you talk? What has to happen to signal this?
Yeah, so I don't think you can do it overtly first time, because ultimate success is that other people will feel that you are ready for the job, right? And you can't do that purely by selling. If I walk into my CEO's office, who has known me unfortunately or fortunately for 20 years, he'll say, "Oh, you're just a technical guy. You're good at technology, live at that." But if I work with the other stakeholders in advance and start creating the environment in which people start thinking me contributing already, coming up with ideas, and when you come with ideas, you partner with people so that you share credit, so that of course they are going to recognize you. Then obviously by the time the decision has to be made, you have made your indirect case. So make the indirect case as strongly as possible, creating sort of a web of people who are going to say good things about you, because they have already seen some of the characteristics. So you have to jump in and help the sales guy, you have to help the marketing person. A lot of those functions, by the way, they are starved for attention. Nobody takes them seriously, they feel like. They always have that. If you give them attention, that only helps you. And they always talk to, who does the CEO talk most? He talks to the salespeople.
Absolutely. Yeah. So make your presence felt. Indirectly build your credibility, build your influence, demonstrate, a lot of your work and assets before you overtly kind of go and say, "Hey, look, I'm ready."
Because I did that when I started a new business at Intel called network processors, which is a new idea programmable processors. I had built enough things that when the time came, I could drop a hint that I could, let me do it for at least 6 months and see how it goes.
Interesting. Yeah. So build the credibility first before you kind of fire the shot.
And other people can say, support you.
There's a question around what was the most memorable technical or product decision that you've taken from Chandramouli. He's very curious about your profile and say, "Hey, look, what are some of the business decisions, product decisions that you've taken that's most memorable to you?"
So if you ever used to have Windows laptops, there used to be a sticker on many Windows laptops, vPro, Intel vPro technology. So I was the inventor of that. It was called active manageability technology, and basically that particular idea came out of the observation that Windows used to have the blue screen problem. And when blue screen, they had to send somebody, because there's no way to remotely remediate it. So we came up with this idea, being networking guys, that why don't we have a small microcontroller next to the NIC, which you can reach when the blue screen, and that should not be controlled by Windows because it's completely independent. And then you can send it a packet and start remediating, and it will save lots of money to it. And that's how the Wipro brand happened for it. And so the reason I brought up that example is that's the question was about what decision, right?
What decision did you make that was kind of most memorable?
So what happened to technology? We were really proud of it. We partnered with IT, and before we take it out, our executives went to talk to our top customers. So IBM was the first one they talked to, and IBM said, "No way, this is a security threat." Because even if you deploy it inside the enterprise, internal threats can come and compliance, blah, blah, blah. And I had to make a quick decision, because the IBM said, don't fix it in 4 weeks, we are not taking it. IBM that time was Intel's #1 customer. So I said to our product manager who was with me, who was also a big GM for our organization later on, I said to him, "We have 4 weeks. We have no way to sort of convince IBM until we show that." So we on the spot made a decision that we will package an internal firewall with the product so that they can deploy it. And that way at least we can solve. And that was a decision really saved the product. Otherwise, it would not have seen the
Interesting.
light of the day.
I'm just kind of scanning through some of the questions and making sure that some of those are new and not answered so far. There's a question from Kunal Gupta, and so his question is, even if you are a product manager, how can you as a product leader encourage the whole team to think like a PM? Any guidance or advice on, how do you enable others around you to think like that? Because otherwise you are in an orchestra where nobody's listening,
Right.
or nobody's in synchrony, right?
Yeah. I think it's easier in a smaller organization than larger. Depends on the size of the organization. But you want to get engineering leaders or your customer support people to get excited. I think most of the people are motivated by success. So if you can continue to harp upon what is going to make you successful with examples, continuously keep on bringing examples from outside. Oh, this customer would love to buy $50 million of the product if we had this, and brainstorm. Then people feel motivated and they feel engaged, and then they start paying attention to that. So I think the bringing some notion of a common success criteria with examples helps.
And so you're also saying that bring that whole voice of the customer
Yes.
as a reference point, to continuously make people aware.
Voice of the customer, sometimes voice of your CEO or some business, because internal constraints are there. Everybody knows what the challenges companies have, and that time, if you are going to solve certain problem for the company, that also is a good motivator.
Nitish Gulati has a question, and so his question is, can you share some examples on how a product manager, product leader can kind of go about influencing without authority, especially when the teams and the decision makers are sitting there in the US?
So from
India.
Yeah. So no matter whether you're in US or in India, I think exercising authority does not work. You have to influence people. Because exercising authority is good enough until you're in the room. You really leave the room and people don't like it. So influencing skills are very important. Then when you are remote, it's even harder, which I agree. But I've seen some people do it really well. What they do is that the time difference can be used to an advantage. Because most of the times the meetings happen, if they don't happen before noon here, you're going to miss out on them. At the same time, there are lots of things that people don't do after 7 o'clock in US that you can volunteer for, right? So I give one example of a person I know. He always volunteered to deal with, we had a team in Bulgaria, another team in Shanghai. The Shanghai team was very strong, but the communication problems were there. And this is a little earlier. Nowadays, China even has less and less of that. And he would volunteer to coordinate. Anytime there's a coordination function or anything, he would say, I would do it. And time-wise, he was the best person to do that.
Absolutely.
Right? And that increased his presence, and influence kept on increasing. So people kept on coming to him.
So find opportunities which you are uniquely positioned
to address the gaps.
To address the gaps, and automatically your value goes up. Very interesting.
The other example there would be, sales in APAC region never gets attention from US, right? Because of time difference, or and sitting in India, you can always help out. You can even afford to fly to Singapore or Hong Kong and try to help out.
Find some local opportunities. So Amit Mohod asks a question, I think, which also is pretty pertinent since you come from a very strong invention technology background. How do you know when your competitors are not very obvious? And he cites examples, for Kodak and how mobile phones are now replacing smart, camera or point and shoot cameras. And so as a technologist, as a product leader who has to look at a little bit broader vision, any tips, any best practices that you've developed, you've learned, you've kind of practiced to say, hey, look, how do you look beyond the obvious?
Yeah, so I think the two sort of things I'll say. When you are almost a monopoly in a market, Kodak or Intel, it's easy to lose out on new opportunities, new directions, right? So Innovator's Dilemma, the Clayton Christensen book, is a classic that you should follow. But other example is you have to be, Andy Grove wrote this book called Only the Paranoid Survive. And he literally practiced it. Intel would have a record quarter. We'll have all hands meeting. And first line he will say how the great quarter was. Then he will say, we are screwed. And he will have some threat, something he will identify. Because he believed that having an enemy is almost necessary. You have to, I hate to say that because it doesn't sound good, psychologically stable, but I have found it very useful. Because even inside a large company, you have friends and you have potential enemies, and you have to focus on those. And that's how you look for trends continuously. That plus Clayton Christensen's lessons are the best way to